and Concord Hall at the Institute of World Culture, and all those that are joining us on the YouTube channel. Many of you know that the Institute of World Culture is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the promotion of brotherhood and lifelong learning. We're located in Santa Barbara, California, and our YouTube channel is IWC in Santa Barbara. So if you go to YouTube and put that in, then you can see other recordings that we've made here at Concord Hall. I'm Robert Moore, and I'm just the moderator. We'll have 7 speakers in total today on various aspects of the topic of towards the rebirth of humanity, the big diagram, which we'll explain as we go along. It's a huge task. Information about the Institute of World Culture can be found on its website, worldculture.org. And you can get a newsletter. All you have to do is email jerry@worldculture.org. Now, at the present time, we're still supposed to be wearing masks in public settings, so we're asking everybody that's live to wear a mask. All the activities of the Lodge are in promotion of its Declaration of Interdependence. And they're posted on the website. And the aim that we'll be pursuing today is aim 6, which is to promote forums for fearless inquiry and constructive dialogue concerning the frontiers of science, the therapeutics of self-transformation, and the societies of the future. All of these factors having to do with the movement towards a rebirth of humanity. At the end of the program, we'll have a question and answer session where you'll be able to ask questions. And those of you who are on the internet, there's a chat function, and we encourage you to use that to make your comments and questions. For those of you in the hall, you know that there's a bathroom off to your left where that light is. And there's information about the Institute on the table at the back. So I'm going to turn this over to explain something about what we're going to be up to Jonathan Colbert, who's given many talks here at the Institute and is also on the board of the Institute.
Thank you, Robert. So we're going to be doing something rather ambitious today. Anybody who has the book Parapolitics by Professor Raghavan Iyer will have noticed that on page 343, there's this pretty involved diagram, and an image of that is on the screen. And so we're going to be trying to take a look at this diagram. It's quite ambitious, but we've got some very capable speakers to help us out. And so I'm going to be just giving an overview of the diagram right now. But I wanted to say just a few things in general about the idea of parapolitics. This year's theme at the Institute of World Culture is universal symbols of transformation and renewal. And we thought that this diagram was kind of the defining symbol, really, of transformation and renewal. And it's fitting that this was probably the last, or if not one of the last presentations that we'll have at the Institute this year. And so this is kind of like a culmination of a year's efforts, you could say. Now, currently in our society, it seems to some, or to many people, that all is really lost. It's just so much chaos. And one wonders, is moral chaos and world weariness all there is? What do we do about all the inner and outer chaos that is apparent? What about our environmental chaos? And closely connected to this is what about our metaphysical chaos? Both inner and outer, there seems to be a sense of separation from the whole scheme of things. But is it really true that if you're not angry or anxious, then you're not paying attention? Is that really true? Or is there another alternative way of looking at the assault of the environment, the dissolution of human speech and conduct, the crumbling of institutions, and the impression that everything is falling apart? Is there another way of looking at all this? Is humanity perhaps going through the painful pangs of a rebirth of some kind? What can we learn to discern? Plato asserted that if you take a person to a diagram, then you can show most clearly that learning is actually recollection. By recollecting the simple ABCs of life, we can recall that life has to do with birth as much as it has to do with death. And in doing so, we can concur with the Hasidic proverb which says, "The castle may indeed be burning, but it has a lord." So who is the Lord? Well, it is ourselves. It's all sentient life, but on one condition. If we can see the upheavals that are going on with non-partisan eyes, without the fear of death, and through the lens of the underlying forces at play, then it is we who are the Lord, so to speak, who will be the enjoyer, in a classical witness sense of the word enjoyer, of all this change. So using this parapolitical diagram and a panel of speakers, I think I'd like to go back to here. This seminar will attempt to uncover the forces at play as humanity remakes itself in the image of hope, healing, and harmony. So, actually I'm going to go back to this slide. As you will see in this diagram, I'm going to do something I've never done before, which is play with this marker thing here. That this is a very dynamic scheme that's been worked out. You'll see a large circle, and you'll see these interlaced triangles.
Tap it again. All right. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. You'll see a large circle in which there is an interlaced set of triangles. Then there's an upward pointing triangle within. And at the very center, you'll see the idea of vision and virtue. Then there are three, I would call them philosophical archetypes, if you will, that is within the center. And then you'll notice all these arrows that go out, etc. Now I'm going to do something that is, get rid of all these things. And then you'll notice that there is a logic of contraction and a logic of expansion. You'll notice there's a dialectic of revolution and a dialectic of reason. So there's all these different dynamics that are going on. And they all proceed from the center where you have these philosophical archetypes of logos, of eros, and will, you could say. So that's basically the idea of it. And the idea is to get the thinker, because all this has to do with individuation and learning to think philosophically. Excuse me. To learn to think impersonally. Excuse me. In terms of dynamics, you could call them metaphysical dynamics, you could call them parapolitical dynamics, but it makes one's interpretation less personal. One becomes, everybody talks about having triggers and so forth. It takes a person beyond one's personal triggers. And you can see that there are simply forces at play here. But the interesting thing here, let's see here. Okay, get rid of this thing here. Anyway, you can see here that it starts, in this case, with vision and virtue, operates through logos, through the politics of perfectibility, and ultimately to the dialectic of transcendence. That's one example. And I'm not going to do all 6 or 7 of these, but I'm just going to show you some examples. Through will, for example, you start and you proceed through the politics of reason to the dialectic of reason. So these are, you could say that they're impersonal forces. Playing with new technology, what could possibly go wrong? There we go. So I just wanted to mention a few more things before we start with our panel. So as you can see, there's 7 really different kinds of politics being referred to here. The politics of perfectibility, the politics of reason, the politics of welfare, of power, of stability, of self-preservation, and ultimately the politics of vision and virtue. The thesis here is that actually the brotherhood of man is in a way already existent in embryo, so that all these forces that are taking place have to do with the unfoldments of all the dynamics of birth. Interdependence, as we know, and this is emphasized a lot here at the Institute of World Culture, is a fact in nature. You can witness, for example, the idea, the phenomenon rather, of the global pandemic. If we've learned nothing else, we can learn that we're all indissolubly connected with each other. So at some level, the embryonic world community already exists. And there's an increasing awareness of this. Scientists, artists, even politicians, and especially the young, are getting the idea that there's an invisible but palpable, tangible, parapolitical community that may indeed actually be coming into being. This invisible community will come out through, actually through the title of our theme at the Institute next year, which has to do with opening doors through nonviolence and magnanimity. So without any further ado, we will go into the next one, which is the politics of perfectibility. Now, I have been chosen as the speaker on that subject, so I will change hats from explainer of the diagram to somebody specializing in the politics of perfectibility, changed hats. And the reason we decided to do the politics of perfectibility first is the idea that all real transformation has to begin with yourself, with ourselves. And this politics of perfectibility has to do with individuation. To get a feeling for this idea of what individuation might mean without confusing it with the feeling of separateness and without negating the idea of interdependence. To get a feeling for this idea of individuation, we can think of the Hindi words that start with sva, like swadeshi, which is making things yourself at home. For example, swaraj, self-rule, swadharma, one's self-chosen sense of duty about what they think is really important to do. And all of these have to do with self-reliance. So really, the politics of perfectibility has to do with political arrangements that acknowledge that the human beings are on a quest, that people are souls, they are in some kind of spiritual evolution, some kind of path, some kind of a journey, that there's meaning for each individual life. We're all here for a reason. And these culminate in the idea of self-direction, self-actualization, and self-transcendence. And these 3 need to be seen from a philosophical rather than from a psychological standpoint. Not that there's anything wrong with a psychological standpoint, but it's just to distinguish it, to actually help clarify what a philosophical standpoint might be. Philosophy clarifies mixed bundles of confused opinions about the world. We can think of the Socratic dialogues here. The philosopher seeks to become clear about what can be said and what cannot be even formulated, and importantly, to become liberated from borrowed ideas and from automatic responses. Philosophy involves disciplined exercise of critical distance through exploration of multiple points of view representing relative truths, all formulations being inconclusive, which is precisely what we're doing here with these 6 parapolitical dimensions, multiple points of view, and that there's a process that one goes through by thinking them all through. The philosopher is concerned with exacting conceptions of truth to the degree possible. The psychologist is concerned with honesty within existing contexts. That's the difference. There's nothing better or worse about either one. Now, but individuation and self-direction requires thinking for oneself. This requires time, energy, capacity, and will, and the strength to overcome outside pressures to think so-called acceptable thoughts. Self-direction then requires a certain fearlessness, which decisively is tested by one's attitude to death. Self-direction requires seeing others as individuals who are more than the sum total of their reactions and roles. This involves seeing oneself and others as souls, each on their own pilgrimage, each with their own self-luminosity, capable of lighting up their own path in the direction of perfectibility. Self-luminosity involves noetic insight, which is learning from a single instant what another would learn from a lifetime. This is the guiding principle within the politics of perfectibility. And it is reflected in the United States Declaration of Independence, which says that there are 3 inalienable rights granted by our Creator and protected by the government: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We are not serving at the pleasure of a king, but have the right to pursue happiness. Individual happiness, like a life with meaning, it involves self-definition. Who am I? What do I really want? Asking these questions constitutes the rigor of each human being's sacred process of individuation. If government cannot grant these 3 inalienable rights, what is the role of government? Because in the Declaration it says that they're given to us by the Creator. So what is the role of government then? Plato held that the citizen could individuate within a polity. At the same time, the citizen can contribute to the polity's growth by developing moral powers such as sophrosyne, which is a Greek idea, and wisdom. So this is our contribution. So true happiness in this light, then, is a mastery of the chaotic desires, fears, and irrational tendencies within ourself. Individuation here requires psychological space, preserved, not granted, by government. Self-transcendence involves the idea that it is okay to lose oneself in the service of others in one's commitment to community. And self-actualization, as depicted by Maslow, requires more than preoccupation with interest, fear of loss, and constant identification of advantages for oneself. It's really, per Maslow, a self-actualizing person accepts himself or herself and the world. He or she is spontaneous, simple, direct, and decisive in their actions. He or she sees beyond personalities, thus extending his or her mental horizon. He or she enjoys autonomy. He or she is confident enough to give unqualified praise to other people. So these are some clues as to what the politics of perfectibility would accommodate. It would not stand in the way of. And speaking of giving unqualified praise to other people, we have a very fine panel who will explain the other 6. So, who is next, Robert?
Well, thank you. Now we have to go to a little switch in technology. Hang on.
John.
We're going to be connecting with John Powers in Norfolk, Virginia, hopefully. We'll see what happens here. You have to bear with us while we... All right, so, okay. John, will you speak so I can see whether you're coming through?
Sure, Robert, yes.
You are coming through. Just a second. Okay, well, John Powers, we chose him because he's one of the most reasonable persons that we know. So that's why we're glad to hear from him. Go ahead, John, talk about reason.
All right, thank you, Robert. I'd like to begin by providing some context for the remarks that follow, and I'll be quoting from and paraphrasing the book Parapolitics as I go along. So I'll begin with a preface where Professor Iyer says the following: "The societies of the future will require a courageous transcendence of our habitual ways of marking the contours of politics. This implies a critical distance from the facts, a fearless recognition of the costs of commitment in different spheres, and a cheerful look at limits and possibilities in the never-ending quest for the city of man." And then he concludes the preface by saying, "This book is especially dedicated to those bored with the prevailing ideologies, but excited about the uncharted future. Neither a treatise on parapolitics nor an agenda for the city of man, it offers a dialectical bridge between them to stimulate constructive thought on issues of common concern." So let's consider for a moment the relationship between politics and parapolitics. Professor Iyer says, "Every human being is involved in a dynamic process of continued acceptance and reacceptance, identification and re-identification of authorities. In our time, authority has broken down because the individual does not have an effective sense of self-determination." He also notes that in classic political thought, there was a concern to locate authority beyond anything that anyone could appropriate, either in wisdom or in justice, or as in the Platonic agathon, the supreme good which is beyond definition. So we all recognize that with the decline of institutional authority and the weakening of formal modes of securing allegiance, the recovery of initiative is a challenge to the capacity of all of us. Each one now must become an effective moral agent capable of translating our own conception of the good into a social goal shareable by others. Each of us participates potentially in a larger self that includes all selves. To understand how each of us is actually involved in creating the future Civitas Humana through our engagement in civic life, we can turn to Professor Iyer's definition of politics given on page 23, because it has a direct bearing upon the presence of the politics of reason in the diagram that we're considering. So there, his definition is follows: "Politics is the self-conscious articulation and continuous pursuit by human beings of shared or common ends in a civil society by a variety of means, ranging from coercive sanctions to rational persuasion and voluntary cooperation." Now, this expansive definition of politics incorporates a wide variety of elements of politics. Professor Iyer then identifies 10 of them that are consistent with this definition. And he then identifies the 6 dimensions of politics that we are discussing today. It might be 7, in reference to the diagram in the book. The author notes, first of all, that self-conscious articulation, which is found in the definition, points to the need for deliberation, and which is the first element shown below politics of reason, while continuous pursuit, also noted in the definition, requires a strong element of will, which is shown at the left vertex of the central triangle as one of the three hypostases of parapolitics, if you will, the other two being logos and eros, speech and sympathy. He points out that deliberation and will sustain articulation and pursuit, and together they constitute a form of initiative or creative intervention in human affairs. In other words, a meaningful form of political activity. Secondly, speech is also necessary for the articulation of political ends. So the politics of reason must draw upon the potency of the apex of the central triangle, that is, logos or speech. When employed to pursue shared or common ends, it requires forms of dialogue and rational persuasion in order to be effective and relevant, which may then lead to consensus. And this is why in the diagram we see that the politics of reason relies upon deliberation, dialogue, and consensus. So the politics of reason clearly draws upon two of the hypostases of parapolitics. The author points out that with certain constraints, such as the necessity for the presence of humane ends as the objects of political action, the dialectic of reason can become the basis of universalization, allocation, and choice in political life. In so doing, he points out that the methods of political activity can and must be reconciled with the principles of political ethics. They must be brought into proper alignment with the means-ends relation, which is the central problem in political philosophy. Means must be proportionate and appropriate to the end, since they are ways to the end. And in the words of Jacques Maritain, quoted in the book, means are the end itself in its very process of coming into existence. The dialectic of reason, therefore, also involves eros, or sympathy, insofar as it is related to the good of all. Now, we should say a few words about both the limits and the promise of reason. We all know that reason is in many cases enlightened by our intuitions, as some of our best insights come from intuition, but are elaborated and acted upon by reason. When intuition dawns upon our minds, reason must be subordinated to it, as Plotinus said. Intuition, being founded on the identification of the mind with the object known, is a superior mode of knowing for the self-conscious being. Also, the correctness of the work of reason depends upon the correctness of our assumptions and basic principles, which are many times not stated and frequently unanalyzed. We also know that reason relies upon memory, which can be the most unreliable faculty in us, as those of us who are growing older have noticed. An accurate representation of facts is also crucial to reason. We know that reason also depends crucially upon discrimination, that is, the ability to clearly distinguish between ideas that may be quite similar. When discrimination fails us, it can lead to confusion and chart a wrong course for reason to follow. For example, as the author notes in the chapter An Unfinished Dream, the fatal limitation of Bellamy's vision was the blurring of the distinction between reason in the classical sense and rationality as a principle of organization. Hence his heavy reliance on the machinery and bureaucracy of centralized authority, his emphasis on efficiency and formal regulation. One could also hold that the exercise of reason in politics depends upon the maintenance of both tolerance and civility. The core of tolerance is the conviction that conflicts could and should be settled by reason, not by force. And civility fosters the sense of fellowship felt by individuals with the society to which they belong. Tolerance makes possible the coexistence of competing forms of partisanship and differing points of view, while civility shows the willingness to transcend partisanship and narrow perspectives in the pursuit of the common good. The politics of reason also depends a great deal upon what Professor Iyer terms critical distance, to which he devotes an entire chapter in the book. He says there that the true statesman, like the conventional political leader, will necessarily exercise dianoia in approximating solutions to emergent problems. He will also continually aspire to the transcendent noesis that reconciles the many and the one, archetypally expressed by Plato in the relationship of agathon. I'm almost there. By maintaining and encouraging a sense of critical distance, the parapolitical statesman could provide appropriate leadership without requiring allegiance to any dogma. It was from this exalted standpoint that Philo-Judaeus saw the politician as a soothsayer, the interpreter of the dreams of men. The end.
Oh, now I have to go through another switch in which Carolyn Dorrance, the president of the Institute, will be coming up. And also, is there a way to turn on this pad?
Guess I better put these on.
So there's our subject that Carolyn's going to illuminate us.
Greetings, hope you're having a good day. And this is all going to enlighten you to participate in parapolitics in any way you can find to do so. My task is to make a few comments about the politics of welfare, and I hope that means I'm on the side of the good guys. Welfaring suggests that we are.
Sorry, you gotta go to change the slide. Sorry.
How did it, got switched.
Okay. Welfare suggests benefit. It suggests good things or doing good things. So it is a welcome relief from some of the other aspects of politics that we are witnessing. It certainly, as we'll hope to point out, can benefit from being under the influence of a path to perfectability and the capacity for reason. It has many, it's very open-ended, has many meanings and many dimensions. So obviously one could desire welfare in the home or in any institution, welfare for the world. For better or for worse, our sense of, our experience of the politics of welfare is what we've been going through for the last several months, in which there are proposals for very specific ways of attaining welfare. And of course, welfare has a very unique capacity of kind of uniting the past the present, and the future. And ideally, that would work to optimize what we do, doing the best we can to improve a situation, and maybe by resolving a problem that's producing conflict. We also want to, as Parapolitics mentions, one of the big problems is the gap between the universal and the unique, and between all through the society, as we're hearing now, various forms of equalization are missing from our activity. But in this open-endedness, where you have multiple values and goals promoted, it's good that other goals like tolerance, equality, and freedom can be united in a kind of welfare for a particular society. But this politics of saying we want this, we want that, the politics of public policy is very fragmented, as we see. There are no guiding principles. There are no explanations of why we want to give hearing to the elderly, or why we want to add another $20 billion to the defense budget, or why we want to give more funding to schools in disadvantaged communities. There so there's no particular order, and it allows individuals, as we're seeing, to come in and say, oh, take out that. Oh, put this in. No, reduce this. So it can become a politics of chaos with no philosophical or even practical synthesis and explanation and defense of it. And so now people are saying to the president over and over again, you haven't explained anything. You don't even have a real agenda. We think that this is because the politics of welfare, as we currently see it, is lacking in a parapolitical definition. And I'm going to read that. I'll use up a couple of my minutes, because that's really the core of the book that Professor Ayers presented us with. He is saying that parapolitics signifies the imaginative application of seminal ideas, vitalizing political theory and practice, and giving the elaboration of fundamental principles into paradigms among persons and between civil means, like passing laws, and humane ends. The quest for political understanding is another goal of parapolitics, and for effective action based upon expanding self-awareness and the ever-receding perspectives of ideals rooted in the ethics, metaphysics, and psychology of self-transcendence. Well, that's a lot to think about and to try to apply reason to. But the point is that there has to be, in really all politics, a dimension that transcends the very ordinary, the very specific, and that which is focused on what might be tangible, concrete proposals, and missing two things we want to leave you with: missing an ethical, a principle dimension that can be used to figure out why a particular proposal for improving welfare is a good idea. Why is it necessary? Why is it not a feasible way to bring about and improve welfare? If you promised everybody free ice cream for a year, it isn't going to really increase the welfare. In fact, it might make it for a lot of work for dentists. So parapolitics is a very special way of, again, this imaginative application of seminal ideas. And they invite explanation, defense, you might say, in the why they'll do some good. And so we seem to be lacking in a way to explain why we want to promote this particular kind of welfare, and just leave it to the late night politics of bargaining and negotiation. The second major point I'd like to point out is the politics of welfare will only achieve its goals, like optimizing and maximizing what that proposal will achieve, if the people doing the proposing actually have done some work upon themselves in the ways that Jonathan spoke of earlier. Because it's the potentialities for conscience, for clarity of vision, of working with other people to bring about consensus. And you're not going to get everything, but you can certainly get something better. And this is, of course, something, a Gandhian approach, that you can take a principle and find a way to shape proposals for achieving your political goals that reflect those principles and have both an ethical power and the power to enthuse and guide the general public. So those who are political leaders are in the process in any way, whether it's just by getting up and making a speech in front of the city council or running for Congress or whatever it is, and you don't have to be a formal politician to participate in the articulation of and defense of some way you think that welfare for the society or for a significant portion of the society that's been discriminated against, to explain it, to defend it, and to persuade people, as the definition of politics says. This won't work without those who are doing this, and it can be everybody, those who are doing this transform themselves, at least modestly, into, you might say, vehicles or agents of the parapolitical idea of focusing on ideals and translating those ideas into the proposals that you're going to promote in some setting. And that may take a lot of work to become a person of tolerance, a person of vision, a person who can reach out in brotherly and sisterly ways and actually draw other people into a dialogue that is worthy. So parapolitics involves inner transformation as well as a good deal of philosophy.
Thank you very much. Now we come to the downward pointing triangle. Curiously, the politics of power is the downward pointing triangle. So political power, as it's understood in conventional politics today, is the ability to control people and public opinion, political parties, and government legislation. Political power can apply to a city, a community, a state, a nation. It can expand to international and transnational relationships. It's essentially expansive. It tends to expand by nature and encompass as much as possible. And it contracts only when faced with the limits of the centripetal forces of constriction. And the three means of political power illuminated there are manipulation, propaganda, and persuasion. And these means can be used, obviously, for self-interest or for the interest of the entire community or the entire world. That's the program that we have here, is to try and benefit the entire world. in what is called American democracy, one can readily perceive the very powerful influence of these means in both the electronic and print media, whatever the motivation. So whatever information we get, like on climate change and vaccination, can easily be manipulated and politicized to the point that light of truth is very hard to find. The propagandizement of false information led the United States to invade Iraq and on a false pretext that was completely in error. And a president of the United States can make 30,000 false and misleading statements and still be considered to be an authority on the truth. And this is something that's come up where all of a sudden truth becomes associated with authority. And that power, you know, if he's the truth, then he has immense power, right? Well, when we established the United States, we thought we got beyond monarchy, but we haven't quite gone beyond it yet. And this whole topic, you know, you think of political power, where you're thinking about, a lot of times you're thinking about military power, force, strength. But behind military power, you get what was talked about in reason is, you know, it's the intelligence, you know, that's the force behind it. And that force then becomes expressed in speech, which the president of the Institute always talked about as our most potent power, is our power of speech. So that's why, you know, media and what people say carries a tremendous amount of force. Now, getting back to truth and how it also can be subverted by political parties that we find. George Orwell, in his novel 1984, gave a very chilling analysis of party loyalty. When the party authority is accepted as absolute, then of course whatever the party says is true, or you have to say that. And then whenever the mind is faced with what actually is real, there's a process of what he calls doublethink, where the mind has the capacity to think the opposite, to think the opposite of what is true, to actually think the opposite. So Simone Weil really perceptively noted that collectivities like organizations, political parties, they can't think. The power of thought, which is part of the power of expansion, is the power of thought. That power is the privilege of the individual, of each of us. So centralized authority, in a sense, is a diminution of power. It's the power of each individual, which it gives the real power of expansion. Like all the rays of the sun are expansive. In 1984, the credo was freedom was slavery. And that's because in their context, the individual only has power insofar as he or she ceases to be an individual. So we're thinking in terms of a rebirth of humanity, just the opposite, right? Most of us are familiar with the phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And the ultimate goal of power is more power and the subjection of all to one's will. And Malcolm X, interestingly enough, inverted that formula and said that that the total absence of power corrupts absolutely. So it shows you what it's looked like on the other standpoint. And what's missing from all these totalitarian visions about power is the conception of limits that Plato described in his dialogue, De Gorgias, that there's no unlimited development in the universe, that everything has some limit, and that the tyrant, he does not understand what is said in the Tao Te Ching, that enough is enough. And that's as far as you can go. Because the universe is governed by law and interdependence. We've been through that. We know more and more that even the tiniest thing, be it an insect or a virus, can affect the totality of what's going on. Vinoba Bhave, the founder of the Indian Institute of World Culture, he prophesies that the time will come when science will replace politics. That's mentioned in Parapolitics. So we're thinking that the time has come for us to use science and reason and sympathy to unmask the amoral, irrational tendencies of contemporary politics. The 14th Dalai Lama, who renounced all political power, yet his salutary influence is felt throughout the world. And he indicated that for a healthy world of tomorrow, we need to apply science to human relationships. And he appeals to, and so does Parapolitics, that you want something really revolutionary, go to the Buddha, go to Christ, go to Socrates. And Buddha said that hatred is never stilled through hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred stilled. This is the eternal law. The contenders do not realize that one day we must all die. And those who realize this resolve their quarrels. So, interesting enough, Bob Dylan in a song said, "I don't hate nothing but hatred." There's an interesting paradox, right? That it's an attitude easily adopted, a kind of doublethink where we perpetuate violence through the hatred of the opposition. Mahatma Gandhi, who repeatedly looked to law, pointed to a law of love, satyagraha, the power of truth. He said, this law will work just as the law of gravitation will work, whether we accept it or not, because that's what a law means. And just as a scientist will work wonders, so will a man who applies the law of love. For the force of nonviolence is infinitely more wonderful and subtle than the force of nature, like, for instance, electricity. So if a person just spent an hour thinking about human relationships in every aspect of life, they would reveal that love, in the words of Professor Raghavan, is the moving power of life itself. It's really the most expansive power. It's the eros, huh? And it's a power that can be applied at all times. Very few of us could prove that E equals mc squared, right? Yet this equation can release immense power of energy. And such, for Gandhi and truth, is the power of the love of truth. What is true is what is real, and what is reality will always win out in the end. So one person, Gandhi says, making a beginning will in the end be enough to destroy a system. The only thing is, it just may not happen in his lifetime. So with those words, go to the politics of stability. And Jenny Sheffield, a member of the Institute and has given talks here before, will elucidate or try and help us out with the politics of stability.
Can I get close to this?
Move the slide.
I think our recent political situation does make us think about how we're between chaos and a vision of order. And so sometimes it's good to think of just what are the dynamics of the politics we're experiencing. So just a few thoughts, and points about the politics of stability. It is a politics that relies on the available means of coercion, conciliation, and coexistence. And from the diagram, you notice that a chief aspect of this kind of politics is that it stresses the logic of contraction. So not perhaps as exciting and creative as its, other logic of expansion that we see on the diagram. And yet, we wish to examine it for this understanding about what it does, which is keeping a balance between change and no change. And we would note in this regard that democracies usually work slowly, usually make piecemeal changes. Only in times of great chaos or war crises, do we actually see it move more quickly. So the politics of stability has some likeness to a kind of minimal conception of politics in its concern for security, preservation of order, and the maintenance of social equilibrium. But like all politics, the politics of stability has to meet emergent needs, and it has to maintain needs that are already committed to. In the politics of stability, you must carry people with you when you, such as your policies, or just when things change. So it's seeking balance, but it is not static. Related to the factor of change, when we think of it, if change occurs constantly, our citizenry does not know what to do. In fact, no one knows what to do. On the other hand, when things do not change at all, or barely change, some could be in a situation where things have become overly rule-bound, then the politics becomes irrelevant and has to be replaced. Because remember, a government meets needs. The primary factor in the concept of stability in politics in our modern period, and we have some of the analysis of Hobbes to be grateful for in that concern, is that we think of order, we're concerned with order, and thereby with law. And in our system, an important element is minimum consensus on the rules, or the rules of the game, referring to one of our main sources of rules being the Constitution. So we do go about politics referring to the formal Constitution, but also to informal norms. And we're doing this with the goal of trying to reduce violence, maintain order, and have a basis for conflict resolution. So the checks and balances, which we're all familiar with, use a model of equilibrium. And it does this within a context of a broader agreement on rules. So we can correct concerning leaders, priorities, and policies. So if we looked at the picture with a little more color, we have a background from the 20th century of large collectives and organized interest groups. And we're basically referring to constitutional pluralism. So we have large political parties, they're big aggregations, and we say they house many groups under big tents. And they're mobilized because they want to pursue their values and their political priorities. So stability actually is possible with this kind of overlapping interests. People are allowed to pursue differences. They disagree on some issues, but they also have commonalities on other issues. There's a tempering effect, and it is conflict, but it's a web of interdependent conflict because it's bounded by rules for cooperation. So the actors negotiate, and we can think of different coalitions, farmers and industry, management and labor, and they negotiate, and in so doing, they compromise according to rules, as we said. The dominant coalition of interests can pass a law, even for those who disagree, and the minority coalitions can also bring minority dominance. Now this leads in some sense to a criticism of the politics of stability. First, we note that on the objective side, people believe in the Constitution such that they do observe the rules of the game, but they also feel a common good. And this is an idea that is full of meaning in the discussion of parapolitics, because the common good can be referring to sympathy, to ethics, hope, vision, all of these subjective elements in politics and amongst the actors in politics. But there may arise a strong polarization such that they can't see, the members of society cannot see commonalities, the common good, or unity. And the risk is that the alliances that we spoke of can become stuck. They just become stuck in polarization, can be on single issues, on parochial issues. And this is the ground for social forces such as the social media, leaders of all kinds, to inflame the passions of the citizenry. In Parapolitics, the author sets a condition, or sets the condition, the context of what we might be seeing in around the year 2000, where he makes a fundamental observation that there is a coming together of the new world of knowledge and the new institutions of society. This is where the elements of the problem, well, I should say where the elements of the problem of this new meeting of forces, new factors, the new knowledge and the new institutions that are emerging. When the problem is political in origin, he does talk about the politics of stability as being problematic because of its, quote, it is suffocating in the corrupt religiosity of exclusiveness and all the verbalization or expression of self-justification. So here's a case of ideas, which are more of the, well, as part of the balancing that is going on, are problematic too. So the ideas of a culture can be too entrenched for a fresh start. We can also justly put criticism on the politics of stability in that it reflects the power distribution of the status quo. Just typically, the politics of stability is not forward-looking. It stresses the logic of contraction, but still, it does compensate. One sees this political analysts notice that it does compensate for this emphasis on this contraction or perhaps not being forward-looking by reluctantly acknowledging the logic of expansion. Otherwise, it will become irrelevant, and then the balance which it's seeking, of course, cannot be maintained.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we'll go to the politics of self-preservation. Maurice Bichef, again, who is, we've heard through many times, is going to help us out with that.
Next slide.
You notice the arrow downward. It's like the bottom of the barrel, you know, or sinners, you have nothing to lose but your chains. But anyway, okay, what we've been saying is that politics is a complex expression of human nature. And so while we've been looking at distinct types of expression, I just wanted to make sure that we understand that there's no single form of expression because it's a reflection of us, of human nature. But obviously there are some major tendencies, and one of them is the politics of self-preservation. Sometimes it's expediency or raison d'etre. If you see Civitas Humana means worldly. So it's really, and I'll kind of explain that as I go along, but it's very worldly politics. It does beg the question, though, if we're here to consider the renewal of humanity, how do we define the self in politics? Self-preservation. But is there another way of defining the self? Or self-preservation itself? It also begs the question, what is it if you're preserving something? What is it that's worth preserving? Right? Self-preservation, what are you preserving? And finally, how do we choose that within us as human beings, since this reflects our nature, and in part, what can we preserve for ourselves, our family, our neighbors, our ecology, and our humanity? What's worth preserving? Now, the traditional starting point for the politics of self-preservation, and sometimes it's even associated with a kind of realism or realpolitik, is the political theorist Nicolo Machiavelli, who lived between 1469 and 1527. The Oxford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says that he was an Italian statesman, and he was less interested in ideal statements of the common good and preserving justice than in empirically investigating the use of power to maintain law and order. His famous claim, of course, is that the ends justify the means. And we've already heard through the politics of reason and other forms of politics that this is certainly a slippery slope because it also seems to advocate the use of immoral means, means that are less than human, if you will, to acquire and maintain power for the purpose of self-preservation. So in order to preserve ourself or our suspected interest, we'll do something where it may not be the nicest thing to do, but we can preserve our power. Now, in fairness to Machiavelli, what he seems to have meant by this is that sometimes in order to maintain law and order in a country, it is necessary for a ruler to do things that, considered in themselves, are not right, but which, considered in their context, are right because they are necessary to prevent greater evils. So this is the rationalization. And we all know what a rationalization is, right? A rationalization is a rational lie. That's what a rationalization is. Anyway, we also know that the ends justify the means if you start to get into that as a way of life and as a way of politics. Can be a very slippery slope. One could easily descend into nihilism or become a cynic of sorts with no moral criteria, which gives little criteria to give to the human mind. Remember, we're speaking of the human mind as a combination of thought, will, and feeling. To give to the human mind an ability to learn and discover, to reason, and little critical distance, as was mentioned in other presentations here, to calmly reflect and sift the true from the false, even in limited context, let alone the fleeting from the everlasting. There's no criteria in this sense. Furthermore, the politics of self-reservation rationalizes the economics of scarcity and competition. So in the economic sphere, everyone is grubbing for their own self-interest. And that's the way economists teach people, right? Most economics, although it's shifting a little bit, is all about the rationality of pursuing your self-interest, and then I pursue mine, and somehow the hidden hand, through some kind of magic, is going to coordinate all of our self-interests, and we're all going to somehow turn out better or be better for it. This slippery slope then shortens our temporal and spatial identities. It's like we're almost like moles, mole-like behaviors. What we need to live here and now, reducing our wants to what can be achieved, and entertaining no options which reek about how all things might happen, of any cause and effect, despising all moral and altruistic claims. So, kind of like rock bottom. All this can be reduced maybe into an idea that we shouldn't glorify selfishness. A self-centered, self-cherishing attitude for oneself and just being concerned with oneself and one's family is preservation. The preservation of one's identity and the political and economic interests which help consolidate one's identity. And yet we go about manipulating the rules of the game and the politics of stability even to be protective of our privilege, although there are others who consolidate identity by simply being against people who have privilege without necessarily coming up with anything further in creative imagination. Nonetheless, it is about one who hates being disturbed. As the mystic philosophy H.P. Blavatsky wrote in 1889, it's a person that prefers an easygoing, unexacting lie to the greatest truth, if the latter requires the sacrifice of one's small comfort or some immediate benefit or reward. Well, for a rebirth of humanity, we need to relook at the idea of self-preservation, maybe with an emphasis more on the self than on just on policies for preservation, although we need both. Human beings always have greater potential than what they are and what they think they have, and this is the parapolitical spirit. And one can always, as a human being, have the option of metanoia, of a complete turning of the heart, not just the mind, to becoming inspired by exemplars, whether the exemplars are in your family or the exemplars are in the newspapers, ones that can inspire you to do better. And we can go back again and again to ponder these qualities in ourself. This can happen if we hit the pause button and get out of the stream of the media and all these external pressures and turn inward to our deep human birthright of inner reflection, whether bringing down whether we bring it down a revelation through deep sleep and dreams or waking life, whether we're moved by suffering spiritually and mentally, and whether we can begin to cultivate a motive to reduce suffering in our daily lives and in our day. How can we reduce other people's suffering? So every human being has this potential, though each one differs as to whether the light of intelligence can shine forth through these different types of politics that we've been speaking about. Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela are two exemplars of this untapped ability. But this brings up an interesting question. In the regular politics of self-preservation, U.S. President Richard Nixon was known for combining cunning with reason, right? With cunning taking the upper hand at several points, this politics of self-preservation, right? Yet, he was also the first to propose, in the United States at least, in modern times, a negative income tax, which we know now as universal basic income, right? And to at least have or house an environmental protection agency, air, water, and even solid waste management. Then you have Menachem Begin, an ex-terrorist, and Anwar Sadat, who are going to walk away from peace negotiations in 1979 when President Carter asked them to try one more time to make peace for Israel and Egypt. Not for their countries, but for the ability of their grandchildren to live in peace. Our common species nature of self-preservation. So self-preservation has these principles, and it's hinted at, I think, in another way by the ancient idea of conatus, which I don't know much about. But it's defined as each thing, insofar as it is in itself, endeavors to persevere in its being. That's definition of self-preservation. Another definition is an innate inclination of a thing to continue to exist and enhance itself. And Spinoza, the philosopher, trying to rationally explain the existence of God, suggested that there is some kind of light or will of God that's both transcendent, which doesn't touch us in a way on earth, but also immanent in us, both. And that brings life to the kenosis. That brings life to the idea of wanting to endeavor and persevere in our being. Now the globe, the living earth, Gaia, is also experiencing a kenosis now. And with the loss of species and climate crisis all over the globe. So for the purpose of self-preservation, we need to bring out this awareness of all human beings as one family, with a larger definition of self and a different view of self-preservation that can lead to the subordination of cunning to reason meeting compassion. We're all on the same lifeboat together, a web of interdependence. Thus, we can renew humanity through the politics of self-preservation by redefining and enlarging the meaning of self and the meaning of a more global sense of preservation.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to bring a synthetic view to this. Professor Elton Hall, who worked with Dr. Raghavan Iyer very intimately, and the Institute owes a lot to him. So we're going to switch to Zoom. I hope.
You will have to tell me, Robert, when I'm on.
Now, wait a sec. I got, yeah, you seem to be okay. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so you're on.
All righty. Thank you. I'm sorry I can't see those attending. This diagram, which applies so much to humanity, I want to suggest also applies to the individual, because we're many people inside ourselves, and all of this can be seen as also going on within the individual. I'd like to draw your attention to two things. I'm treating this diagram as if it were a mandala for contemplation or meditation. The two things are this. Outside the drawn circle, there is a hinted circle at the top called cosmopolis, which extends even beyond the circle that we see. And all of those forms of politics push beyond that drawn circle, and they form three forms of dialectic and three forms of logic. If you draw a line from the logic of contraction across to the logic of expansion, and down to the logic of equilibrium, and back to the logic of contraction, you have another downward pointing triangle. Similarly, if you draw a line from the dialectic of reason to the dialectic of revolution, and up to the dialectic of transcendence, and back to the dialectic of reason, you have this larger six-pointed star, just like you do inside the circle. To me, this implies that when things work out in consciousness, and insofar as we can instantiate it in action, something bigger than even Civitas Humana, the worldly community, Civitas Humana, the human community, and Civitas Dei, the divine community, is synthesized on a broader level than we can ever picture, which is one of the reasons why we're probably told that the politics of vision and virtue are always receding, even if we can approach them. Parapolitics in the middle, in that triangle, we can look at it in three ways. In one, it's the architectonic perspective from which the six dimensions of politics can be understood. In another, it is the synthesizing seventh that draws the essence of those six in light of the good into itself. Put another way, it is the beating heart of politics of any kind, whether it is noticed or not. And then we're told in that triangle that parapolitics is the politics of vision and virtue. Virtue there is quite correct. It's not the Latin word virtus, but virtue. Vision gives us meaning, and the meaning we find in anything will depend on the breadth and depth of our vision. Virtue gives value, and its value as a force. The very term virtue comes from the Latin root that means power or force. And we're told by Professor Iyer that parapolitics deals with universal benevolence, constructive formulation, and creative action. If you look at the diagram, you will notice each one of the politics has three words in it. Those can be related to benevolence, formulation, and action. The dialectics also have three words. They can be related similarly, but the logics are all one word, and that's worth reflecting on. In fact, if you go from the logic of contraction, logic of expansion, and make that triangle, of course, it's producing homeostasis, we're told, in the logic of equilibrium. But homeostasis is not something frozen or fossilized. Think of homeostasis in the body. It is inherently unstable. That is, it has to readjust through time constantly, which is why when it's cold, you go outside, the body has to generate more heat. When it's warm, it generates less heat, and so on through all the different myriad functions in the body. So it is in a community. So the degree to which parapolitics manifests and enlivens the 6 kinds of politics, we're told depends upon, from the individual and collective point of view, critical distance, recognition of the costs of commitment, and limits and possibilities in whatever dynamics or structures we have. And each of those apply to those 3 elements of parapolitics: benevolence, constructive formulation, and collective action. And we're told they all are always involved in timing within whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. Given this kind of synthetic look, we can see why parapolitics, from the standpoint of critical distance, must ultimately break with that downward pointing triangle, even though it suffuses that triangle, and why its essentially creative stance requires compassion, for its vision cannot be enforced on others. Costs of commitment deeply include the recognition that any formulation, paradigm, model, or implementation falls short of the ideal. Hence, courage is required, including the courage to appreciate and understand the vision of others. Both require a dialectical response, which can be at its best a way of distilling from those various visions something more fundamental. And of course, there are always limits and possibilities. That is, we can say there may be limits. Of course, there will be limits. But instead of seeing that kind of as a wall, it is always possible to discern opportunities if we can think broadly enough with broadening benevolence, creative thinking. As the vision is held, not as an instrument just to do something, but with virtue, we can always discern those possibilities. So the whole diagram is both the model of what is and a vision of what can be. For what is always contains the possibility of transcendence, along with the limits of the present, but we look to the future. So I'd like to end, since this whole year was spent on the meaning of symbols, I'd like to end with a symbol. Think of Shiva, the destroyer or creator, in an endless dance